9 years she vanished. Now, an oil drill screams, unearthing her truck from a desert tomb 16 feet deep. More than a missing rancher, it's a conspiracy a killer tried to bury forever. What secrets will her steel coffin reveal? The Sonoran desert breathed dust, a landscape of skeletal saguaros and secrets baked into its crust by a relentless, indifferent sun. It was Tuesday, the 24th of October, 2023. 9 years had passed since Jessica Jess Whitman, a woman whose laughter was said to echo the wild freedom of the Arizona frontier, had ridden out with her herd, her formidable 1,998 Dodge Ram, an extension of her own tenacious spirit, trailing dust behind her. The narrative had long been sealed, a tragic miscalculation in an unforgiving land, the desert claiming another soul. Her truck, that metallic beast with the proud longhorn bullhorns fixed to its grill, was presumed to be a mangled epitaph somewhere in an unmarked grave of rock and sand. But the desert, it turned out, wasn't a keeper of permanent silences. Sometimes it merely waited for the right kind of violence to make it speak. Daniel Reyes, lead driller for Horizon Deep Exploration, knew the language of the earth beneath his feet. He could interpret its groans, its resistances, its sudden yields as the tungsten carbide teeth of his drill bit devoured rock and ancient sediment. They were on a new lease, a desolate patch miles from the nearest paved road, chasing a promising seismic anomaly. The morning had been routine, the thrum of the generators, the rhythmic clank and whir of the rotary table, the steady, satisfying descent. Then, the earth stuttered. It wasn't the teeth-jarring halt of hitting impenetrable granite, nor the gritty protest of a dense clay lens. This was different. A sickening metallic rending, a sound that traveled up the thousands of feet of drill pipe, like a scream from the abyss. The sophisticated array of sensors in Daniel's climate-controlled cabin went haywire. Torque readings shot off the scale, the digital numbers a frantic red blur. The entire rig, a multi-ton behemoth of steel, juddered as if struck by a subterranean fist. Impact. Shut down. Shut it all down. Daniel's voice, usually calm and measured, was a raw shout into the rig's intercom. He didn't wait for confirmation, his hand already slamming the master kill switch. The abrupt silence that crashed down was heavier, more unnerving, than the industrial roar it replaced. Only the frantic electronic beeping of alarms pierced the sudden void, a soundtrack to the dawning horror in the eyes of the crew. Cole Sarge Peterson, the site foreman, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh sun and harder decisions, was by Daniel's console in a heartbeat. "Talk to me, Reyes. What in the seven hells did we hit?" Felt like the goddamn earth cracked open. Daniel could only shake his head, the back of his neck cold, despite the cabin's growing warmth. Not rock, Sarge. Not solid like that. It was a tear, a puncture, like pushing a fist through a rusty can, then hitting something unyielding inside. His mind raced through the geological surveys. Nothing. No abandoned mine shafts plotted, no significant cavities, no mention of anything but stratified layers of sand, conglomerate, and shale for another 1,000 feet. The protocol for an unknown obstruction was clear, but the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken dread. Slowly, meticulously, they began the process of tripping out, retracting the drill string. Each section of pipe winched upwards felt like it was pulling not just steel, but a terrible secret from the Earth's reluctant grasp. The weight sensors were the first anomaly. They were lifting more than the weight of their own equipment. Something was impaled, or snagged, refusing to let go. Hours bled into a hazy, sun-scorched afternoon. The air crackled with tension. Finally, the drill bit itself, a monstrous mud-caked snout, breached the surface, but it wasn't alone. Twisted and mangled around its cutting head, like a grotesque metal vine, was something else. Not rock, not petrified wood. It was a sheet of thick, rusted metal, violently contorted, paint still clinging to it in patches, a faded, almost bruised crimson. And embedded within a fold of the tortured steel, as if clutched in a dying hand, was a shard of thick, laminated glass. A hush fell over the roughnecks. Sarge, his face ashen beneath his tan, approached it cautiously. Using the tip of a crowbar, he pried at another section of the debris still clinging to the drill assembly. more rusted red metal. Then, something else. A piece of chrome, glinting defiantly amidst the rust and dried mud. It was part of a letter, an A. Then next to it, an M. Ezzy. Sheriff Marcus Allen of Pinal County arrived as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of blood, orange and bruised purple. He'd been a rookie deputy when Jess Whitman vanished, the case a lingering shadow in his memory. He remembered the posters, the grieving family, the sheer baffling emptiness of the desert that had offered no clues. As his deputies began to secure the perimeter, their flashlights cutting swathes through the gathering dusk, the decision was made to excavate around the drill's entry point. The backhoe operator, a young man with wide, nervous eyes, handled the controls with uncharacteristic delicacy. The bucket scraped away layers of compacted earth, each pass revealing more. The depth gauge on the drilling logs read 16 feet. 16 feet of earth that had lain undisturbed, or so they'd thought. Then, under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, it began to emerge. Not just debris, but a shape, a form, the distinct, unmistakable curve of a vehicle's roofline, crushed and distorted. The crimson was undeniably the color of Jess Whitman's Dodge Ram. A collective, choked gasp went around. Deputy Miller, who'd grown up hearing tales of the vanished rancher, felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. He focused his flashlight beam on the front section of the emerging wreck, still half swallowed by the earth. And there, caked in mud but horrifically intact, were the iconic bullhorns. One was bent grotesquely sideways, as if in a final, silent bellow of protest. The other pointed accusingly towards the dark, star-dusted sky. "It's her truck," Sheriff Allen breathed, the words barely audible. His gaze, however, was fixed on something else, a detail that made his blood run cold. The drill hadn't just struck the roof, it had punched through it. And as they cleared more earth, peering into the violated cab, they saw why the initial impact had felt so yielding before hitting something harder. The driver's seat was a mangled ruin of springs and rotted fabric, but slumped against the passenger door, partially shielded by the twisted dashboard, was not just the expected detritus of a long-lost vehicle. There, amidst the decay, encased in a grotesque tableau of rust and settled dust, were the unmistakable outlines of skeletal remains, clad in the tattered remnants of what might have once been denim and leather. The drill, in its violent descent, had missed them by inches. The desert hadn't just been keeping a truck, it had been cradling a coffin. The discovery was no longer about a missing vehicle, it was about a woman, entombed. The metallic shriek Daniel Reyes had heard was not just the agony of steel, it was the belated, horrifying confession of the desert itself, forced open by a drill bit, revealing a secret far darker than anyone had dared to imagine. This wasn't a cold case being reopened, it was a grave being exhumed. And the bullhorns, symbols of Jess's defiant life, now stood as grim sentinels over a scene of unimaginable, long-concealed violence. The news of the discovery in the desolate stretch of Section 34, owned by the State Land Department and leased to Apache Wells Exploration, spread through Pinal County like a tumbleweed in a dust devil. It didn't just whisper through the mesquite and creosote, it screamed through phone lines, crackled over diner counters, and landed like a physical blow in the quiet, shadowed corners where the memory of Jess Whitman had been carefully preserved, a fragile thing wrapped in 9 years of sorrow and unanswered questions. Jess. Even her name had a snap to it, a spark. She'd been 29 in the fall of 2014, but age seemed an ill-fitting descriptor for a woman who moved with the timeless, confident grace of a desert predator. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the soft, curated way of city women. Her beauty was in the sun creases around her startlingly blue eyes, eyes that could spot a stray calf a mile off or pierce through a dishonest cattle buyer's bluster. It was in the strength of her hands, calloused from leather reins and barbed wire, yet capable of the gentlest touch when tending a sick foal. Her dark hair, usually braided tight or tucked under a dusty Stetson, held streaks of sun-bleached gold, a testament to countless hours spent under the Arizona sky. She'd inherited the Running W, a sprawling hardscrabble ranch bordering the Tonto National Forest, from her grandfather, a man as tough and unyielding as the granite outcrops on his land. Many had expected her to sell, to take the money and run to an easier life. A young woman alone, they'd murmured, couldn't possibly wrestle a living from that unforgiving land, especially with cattle prices fluctuating like a hummingbird's wings and water rights, a constant battle. Jess had proven them all wrong. She didn't just manage the running W, she was the running W, its heart, its grit, its stubborn refusal to be broken. Her days were a blur of hard labor, starting before dawn with the scent of strong coffee and the nicker of her prized quarter-horse, Dusty. She could mend a fence line with the efficiency of a seasoned hand, pull a calf in a blizzard, and navigate the treacherous switchbacks of Wild Horse Canyon in her Dodge Ram as if it were an extension of her own limbs. That truck, the cherry red 1998 Dodge Ram 2500 Cummins turbo diesel, was legendary. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was her throne, her mobile command center, her sanctuary. The distinctive longhorn bullhorns, salvaged from a prize-winning rodeo bull her grandfather had once owned, were mounted on the grill, not as a novelty, but as a statement. I am here. I am not to be trifled with. She'd once famously used it to tow a rival rancher's pickup out of a bog during monsoon season, a gesture of grudging respect that had earned her a silent nod from the man, though no words were exchanged. He, like others, had underestimated her. What was lost when Jess vanished wasn't just a woman. It was a linchpin. The running W, despite the valiant efforts of her aging uncle who came out of retirement to try and hold it together, had faltered. Fields lay fallow, fences sagged, and the once thriving herd had dwindled. Hope, too, had withered. For the first year, search parties had combed the vastness, fueled by a desperate, dwindling optimism. Flyers with her smiling, sun-kissed face had faded on notice boards from Globe to Casa Grande. The official verdict of accidental death, presumed lost in the desert, had been a bitter pill, but one that, over time, some had reluctantly swallowed. It allowed for a kind of closure, however unsatisfactory. Now, that flimsy bandage had been ripped away, exposing a raw, festering wound. Sheriff Marcus Allen stood by the yellow tape at the excavation site, the desert night cold around him. The forensic lights cast long, dancing shadows, turning the scene into a macabre stage. He remembered Jess Whitman, not just as a missing person file, but as a vibrant, almost intimidating presence. He'd encountered her once, years before she disappeared, during a dispute over stray cattle with a neighboring rancher, a belligerent man known for his quick temper and even quicker fists. Jess had stood her ground, calm and unyielding, her voice low but firm, her hand resting almost casually on the stock of the rifle she always carried in her truck's gun rack. The dispute had been settled, not by his intervention, but by her sheer, indomitable will. She hadn't been reckless, but she hadn't backed down an inch. That kind of strength, he knew, could earn respect, but it could also breed resentment in those who felt diminished by it. The items being painstakingly catalogued from the truck's cab were like shards of her life. A single worn leather work glove. She'd always complained about losing one. A Leatherman multi-tool, its blades showing signs of frequent use. And then, Detective Sandoval brought him a Ziploc bag. Inside, caked with dried mud but unmistakably her, was a heavy silver concho belt buckle, intricately tooled with a running horse design. It was her favorite, the one she'd won at a barrel racing event in her late teens. He'd seen her wearing it. The sight of it now, a relic from a steel tomb, sent a fresh wave of cold dread through him. This wasn't just evidence, it was a piece of her soul, tarnished but enduring. The loss of Jess had also stolen a certain sense of security from the scattered, isolated communities. If a woman as capable, as intimately familiar with the land as Jess Whitman, could be taken, buried, and erased so thoroughly, then who was truly safe? Other women ranchers, the few who dared to work alone, had undoubtedly felt a chill deeper than any winter wind in the years following her disappearance. Her story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the dangers that lurked not just in the unforgiving landscape, but perhaps in the hearts of men. The discovery now confirmed the darkest unspoken fear. Jess hadn't just been lost to the elements, she had been put there. The deliberate nature of the burial, 16 feet deep in compacted earth, miles from any road, spoke of a chilling premeditation. This wasn't a panicked attempt to hide a body after a confrontation gone wrong. This was an execution, followed by a determined, laborious effort to ensure she was never found. Someone had wanted Jess Whitman erased from the face of the earth. As the first hint of dawn touched the distant peaks of the Superstition Mountains, casting a pale, ghostly light over the scene, the reality of what they had found began to truly settle. The vibrant, laughing, fiercely independent Jess Whitman, who could ride like the wind and tame the wild heart of the running W, hadn't just died. She had been silenced, her life stolen, her final resting place, a crude, unmarked grave dug with malice. The desert had been forced to give up its secret, but the silence it had kept for 9 long years now felt less like an act of nature and more like a conspiracy that had ended in murder. The bullhorns on her resurrected truck, once symbols of her defiance, now seemed to cry out for a vengeance that had been 9 years delayed. The ghost of Wild Horse Canyon had, in the most horrific way imaginable, finally come home. And with her return came the terrifying certainty that a killer had walked among them, undetected, for nearly a decade. The unearthing of Jess Whitman's Dodge Ram and the chilling discovery within its crushed cab didn't just tear open the earth, it ripped through the thin veneer of closure that had settled over Pinal County for 9 long years. The official story, once a somber footnote of a woman lost to the unforgiving wilderness, now felt like a hastily scribbled lie, an insult to Jess's memory and a stark indictment of a system that had, perhaps too willingly, accepted the desert's silence as an answer. Back in the autumn of 2014, the initial response to Jess's disappearance had been fervent, born of genuine community concern and the raw fear that such a capable individual could simply vanish. For weeks, volunteers on horseback and ATVs, guided by deputies from the Pinal County sheriffs, was the area where the truck was found. State land, but not impossibly remote from areas Jess frequented, not more thoroughly considered for a clandestine burial. The coordinates of the discovery showed it was less than 10 miles from a seldom-used access road leading towards the mountains, a route Jess might have used, or been forced to use. The reaction from the community was a volatile mix of grief, anger, and a chilling sense of vindication for those who had never believed the accident theory. Old Man Hemlock, a fixture at the local feed store who'd known Jess since she was a girl, spat tobacco juice onto the dusty ground. "Accident, my ass," he'd grumble to anyone who would listen. That girl was too smart, too tough. Someone did this to her. And the law back then? They didn't want to see it. Easier to blame the coyotes and the sun. The system, as it were, now creaked into motion, but it was a ponderous, slow-moving beast burdened by the passage of 9 years. Witnesses, if there had been any, were harder to find, their memories faded or distorted. Potential evidence at the burial site, beyond the truck and its immediate contents, was long obliterated by time and the elements. The very soil that had encased Jess's truck department had crisscrossed the rugged terrain surrounding the running W and the vast, arid stretches where she'd been headed with her cattle. Air support, limited by budget and the sheer scale of the search area, had scanned the canyons and mesas, looking for any sign, a glint of red metal, a flash of color, anything out of place in the monotonous landscape. But the desert was a master of concealment. Days turned into weeks. The initial surge of manpower dwindled as hope frayed. The Pinal County Sheriff's Department, then under the leadership of Sheriff Hank Drummond, a man nearing retirement and known more for his folksy charm than his investigative tenacity, was stretched thin. Resources were, as always in rural counties, a constant concern. Major crimes were infrequent, and a prolonged, complex missing person case involving such an immense and challenging search area was a drain they were ill-equipped to sustain indefinitely. No clear evidence of foul play had emerged. No ransom note, no credible witnesses seeing anything amiss. Jess was known to be independent, sometimes taking off for days to check remote fence lines or track stray cattle, though was now a frustratingly sterile witness. Daniel Reyes, the oil rig operator who had made the discovery, was interviewed multiple times. He recounted the sickening crunch, the metallic shriek, the unyielding resistance his drill had met. His testimony was purely technical, yet it underscored the brutal efficiency of the burial. 16 feet. That took time, effort, and machinery. A lone individual with a shovel? Unlikely. This suggested planning, perhaps multiple perpetrators, or at least someone with access to heavy equipment. Had anyone reported such equipment missing or suspiciously used around the time Jess vanished? Records from 9 years ago were being painstakingly re-examined, a bureaucratic archaeology expedition in itself. The social injustice aspect, particularly concerning the vulnerability of women in isolated agricultural settings, began to surface in editorials and heated online forums. Jess Whitman had been a symbol of female strength and capability in a traditionally masculine sphere. Had her gender made her a target? Had it made the initial investigation less rigorous, less inclined to suspect foul play? These were uncomfortable questions, but they resonated deeply with other women working the land. Women who knew the sting of dismissive attitudes, the constant need to prove themselves twice over, and the subtle, ever-present threat of violence in areas where help was often miles and hours away. One of the original investigating deputies, now retired, usually with some form of communication. The narrative began to subtly shift. Whispers in the local diner, comments made just out of earshot, started to paint a picture not of a victim, but of someone who had perhaps courted disaster. A woman alone out there. It's a hard life. She always pushed the limits. Maybe she just got turned around. Desert can fool anyone. These weren't necessarily malicious sentiments, but they carried an undercurrent of resignation and living in another state. Was tracked down by an enterprising journalist. His televised interview was a masterclass in deflection and faded memory. We did everything we could with the resources we had, he insisted, his eyes not quite meeting the camera, a willingness to accept the simplest, if bleakest, explanation. It was easier to blame the vast impersonal desert than to consider it's a big desert. Tragic, yes, but we had no reason to suspect. Well, what a darker human element. Jess's family, primarily her stoic Uncle Ray, who'd driven down from Montana, they're saying now. His words, meant to reassure, only fueled the growing outrage. No reason to suspect? To spearhead the search, had felt the shift keenly. Ray Whitman, a man whose face was already etched with the hardships, a headline blared the next day. Or no will to investigate. The inertia of the justice system, once set of a ranching life, found his pleas for continued, intensified searching met with sympathetic but increasingly firm explanations of resource limitations, and on a course of accidental death, was proving difficult to overcome. Evidence had to be re-evaluated through the lack of new leads. He'd argued, his voice hoarse with grief and frustration, that Jess wouldn't just get lost. She knew that land like the back of her hand. Her truck was powerful, well-maintained. Something new, more sinister lens. Old witness statements, if they even existed in detail, had to be scrutinized for overlooked clues was wrong. But without evidence, his words were just the anguished cries of a grieving relative. The initial investigators were now either retired, moved on, or defensive. The momentum of a cold case, especially 19 Media, a handful of small newspapers and a regional television station, had covered the initial disappearance with a flurry of interest. But as weeks, years dormant, and now declared a homicide, was like trying to turn a battleship in a bathtub. Sheriff Allen felt the pressure from all sides. From the media, from higher authorities, from the anguished faces of Jess's remaining past with no developments. Jess Whitman's story had slowly slipped from the headlines, replaced by county fairs, local politics, and high family, and from his own conscience. He knew this wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about restoring school football. She became another tragic tale of the desert, a reminder of its inherent dangers. The official conclusion, delivered faith, about acknowledging past failings, however unintentional. It was about proving that the system, even belatedly, could deliver some 3 months after she vanished, was accidental death due to environmental exposure, remains, and vehicle unrecovered. Case justice for a woman whose voice had been brutally silenced and whose memory had been almost lost to the desert's false narrative closed. A shrug from the system. Now, in 2023, that shrug had become an earthquake. But as the days turned into weeks with no immediate breakthroughs, no prime suspects emerging from the shadows of the past, A. Bealey, the rusted bullhorns, exhumed from their premature grave, were a potent symbol of past failures. Sheriff Marcus' chilling thought began to take root. What if the killer, or killers, had been as meticulous in covering their tracks above Allen, felt the weight of those neglected echoes keenly? He had been a deputy then, part of the search, and he ground as they had been in burying Jess Whitman below it. What if 9 years of silence had given them an almost insurmountable head, remembered the pervading sense of helplessness, but also, if he was honest with himself, a slow, creeping acceptance of the official start? The investigation was no longer just a search for a killer. It was a race against the fading echoes of the narrative as the leads dried up. It was easier. It allowed them to move on to the next crisis, the next call past, a desperate attempt to reconstruct a crime from a few corroded artifacts and the ghost of a woman who deserved more. Looking back, he saw the missed opportunities, the lines of inquiry perhaps not pursued with enough vigor. Had they been than the indifferent shrug of a system that had, perhaps, failed her twice. The dust of 9 years was not easily disturbed, nor were the memories it had settled upon. In the incident room at the Pinal County Sheriff's Department, now dominated by a large-scale map of Section 34 and the surrounding lands, Sheriff Marcus Allen and Detective Maria Sandoval waded through the ghosts of 2014. The original case files were sparse, a collection of faded witness statements, rudimentary search logs, and the depressingly brief final report. It was like trying to assemble a complex machine with half the parts missing and no instruction manual. "Anything jump out from the initial witness interviews, Maria?" Allen asked, rubbing his tired eyes. The fluorescent lights of the station hummed, a stark contrast to the desert silence where Jess Whitman had met her end. Sandoval, a meticulous investigator known for her ability to connect disparate facts, sighed. Mostly just expressions of shock, people saying Jess was too experienced to get lost. The usual character references. A few mentioned she was private or kept to herself when it came to business. Nothing concrete about specific enemies, though. She tapped a thin folder. This is interesting, though. A notation about a minor complaint Jess filed about 3 weeks before she disappeared. Trespassing. Said she found fresh tire tracks and survey markers on the northern perimeter of the swept along by the prevailing current. He picked up a flimsy typewritten sheet, a log of individuals informally spoken to during the initial neighborhood canvass. Most entries were brief, no information, didn't see anything unusual, expressed sympathy. Then his finger stopped on an entry so brief it was almost invisible. R. Vasquez, adjacent property owner, south boundary of Running W, reported hearing engine noise, possibly heavy vehicle, late on 10 divided by 18 divided by 14. Estimated time, pre-dawn. Dismissed as likely ranch equipment or border patrol activity. The 18th of October, 2014. That was the day after Jess was last seen heading out with her cattle. She was officially declared missing on the 20th of October, when she failed to make a scheduled supply run into town, pre-dawn. Heavy vehicle. Allen's mind snagged on it. Ramon Vasquez, he murmured. Old Ramon. A reclusive, elderly man who owned a small, neglected plot of land bordering the southern edge of the Running W, mostly used for grazing a few goats. He was known for being a man of few words, his memory often clouded by age and cheap whiskey. Back in 2014, his report, relayed third-hand by a volunteer searcher, had likely been dismissed as the ramblings of a senile old man. But now, juxtaposed with a 16-foot-deep grave and a heavy-duty truck that couldn't have driven itself there, it felt different. "Sandoval," Allen said, his voice suddenly sharper. "Get me everything on Ramon Vasquez. Is he still alive? Still on that property?" A quick database search confirmed Ramon Vasquez was indeed still alive, aged 87, and still residing at the same dilapidated homestead. An officer was dispatched. As they waited, Allen's mind drifted back. He remembered Jess, not just as a strong rancher, but as a surprisingly astute observer of her surroundings. He recalled an incident a few months before she disappeared. He'd been called to the Running W regarding a minor trespassing complaint, some city hunters who'd strayed onto her land. Jess had handled them herself by the time he arrived, sending them packing with a warning that was both polite and utterly terrifying. After they'd left, she'd leaned against her truck, the ever-present bullhorns framing her silhouette against the setting sun. "You know, Marcus," she'd said, her blue eyes narrowed thoughtfully, "it ain't just the 2 Running W, near Wild Horse Canyon." Claimed she hadn't authorized any survey. Allen frowned. "I remember that vaguely. It was dismissed, wasn't it? Property line disputes are common. We figured it was just some rival outfit trying to push their luck, or maybe even a mistake by a survey crew." "No follow-up report," Sandoval confirmed. No indication of who the surveyors might have been. Drummond just noted, advised Miss Whitman to post clearer, no trespassing signs. The inadequacy of it hung in the air. Wild Horse Canyon, a rugged, remote part of Jess's land, rich in lore about hidden springs and old mining claims. It was also geographically closer to where her truck had eventually been found. Meanwhile, Jess's Uncle Ray, staying at a local motel, found himself adrift in a sea of fractured recollections. Sleep offered little respite, his nights filled with images of Jess as a pigtailed girl learning to rope, then as a young woman, proud and determined, taking over the ranch. He clutched a faded photograph of her, astride Dusty, her smile as wide and bright as the Arizona sky. The silver concho belt, now an exhibit in an evidence bag, had been her pride. He remembered the day she'd won it, the sheer exhilaration on her face. Detective Sandoval visited him the next morning. Ray was initially withdrawn, the trauma of identifying Jess's few remaining personal effects having taken a heavy toll, but Sandoval's quiet empathy slowly drew him out. She didn't press. She simply asked him to talk about Jess, about the months leading up to her vanishing. She was preoccupied, Ray said slowly, his gaze distant. The last couple of times I spoke to her on the phone, maybe a month, 6 weeks before, she sounded different, tense. I asked her if everything was all right with the ranch. He paused, his brow furrowed in concentration. She said something about shadows on the land. I thought she was being poetic, you know, like talking about a drought or falling cattle prices. But then she mentioned those survey markers. She was angry about them. Said it felt like someone was sneaking around, trying to steal a piece of legged coyotes looking for a free meal you gotta watch out for. Sometimes it's the ones in fancy trucks, looking to swallow you whole, land and all. AgriCorp, he'd asked. The massive agricultural conglomerate had been aggressively buying up smaller ranches in the county, often using hardball tactics. Jess had just shrugged, a wry smile playing on her lips. Or their friends. Lots of hungry coyotes out here. Some wear boots, some wear suits. You just got to be able to tell the difference by the tracks they leave. At the time, he'd dismissed it as Jess being Jess, fiercely protective of her land, naturally suspicious of outsiders. Now, her words echoed with a chilling prescience. The tracks left by her killer were deep and deliberately obscured. The deputy returned 2 hours later, with Ramon Vasquez in tow. The old man was frail, his eyes milky with cataracts, but there was a stubborn set to his jaw. He smelled faintly of unwashed clothes and old memories. Sandoval led him gently to a chair. Mr. Vasquez, Alan began, his voice soft, we appreciate you coming in her heritage. Did she say who she thought it might be? Sandoval asked gently. Ray shook his head. Number just that it was near the old Apache Tears claim. That's a section up in Wild Horse Canyon. Supposedly has a year-round spring, though I never saw it produce much. Land's no good for grazing up there, too rocky. But Jess always said it was the wildest, most beautiful part of the running W. Sacred almost to her. He looked directly at Sandoval, a flicker of understanding dawning in his grief-stricken eyes. We're looking into what happened to Jess Whitman 9 years ago. Ramon nodded slowly. La Jessica. Buena muchacha. Fuerte. Good girl. Strong. Do you remember talking to someone back then? That land. It wasn't about money for Jess, it was about respect. Respect for what came before, Mr. Vasquez. About hearing something around the time she went missing. The old man frowned, his brow furrow. Sandoval felt a prickle of intuition. The Apache Tears claim, was there any history of dispute over that specific parceling as he dredged through the silt of nearly a decade? Mucho ruido, he finally said, his voice ras. Mr. Whitman? Ray thought for a moment. Years ago, before Jess took over, some Phoenix development pie. A lot of noise. Not the usual. Not Jess's truck, más grande, más pesado, bigger, heavier. He gestured vaguely south, towards the desolate stretch where Jess's truck had been found, and company made inquiries. Grandad sent them packing. He said they wanted the water rights, minimal as they were, for area that was, significantly, accessible from the little-used access road near his own property line, a road that bypassed the some harebrained resort idea further down the valley. They offered good money, but he wouldn't sell. Jess' main entrance to the running W. When was this, Ramon? Alan pressed gently. Do you remember the day felt the same way? He then recalled something else, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time. About 2? Noche, he said. Oscuro. Night. Dark. He thought for a moment, his gaze distant months before she went missing. Jess mentioned getting another unsolicited offer for just that section. A blind offer, through a lawyer. The dogs, they barked like the devil was out there. Before the sun. Then, silencio. She laughed it off, said they were vultures. But she sounded more annoyed than amused. Back at the station, Sandoval. Did you see anything, Ramon? Any lights? He shook his head slowly. Solo el ruido. He cross-referenced the Apache Tears claim with county land records and any development proposals from around 2013-201 luego. Nada. Just the noise. And then, nothing. He looked at Alan, a flicker of something knowing in his clouded fore. The name of the law firm that had made the blind offer was generic. A shell company, likely. But then, eyes. Bad people, Sheriff. Took her. The desert. It doesn't take trucks like that. Not she found a tangential connection. One of the principals in that long-ago Phoenix development company, the one Jess's grandfather had like that. It wasn't much. The testimony of an elderly man about a noise heard 9 years ago, rebuffed, had later become a silent partner in a much larger agricultural corporation, AgriCorp Solutions, that had bought, it would be ripped apart in court. But it was something. It corroborated the theory that heavy machinery might have been involved, up several ranches bordering the Running W in the years leading up to 2014. AgriCorp was known for its aggressive, and it placed that machinery active on the night after Jess was last seen alive, in the vicinity of where she expansion and its focus on water-intensive crops, a constant source of tension in the arid region. Their local operations manager was ultimately found. This wasn't a random cattle drive accident. This was a plan unfolding under the cover of darkness. The time was a man named Elijah Thorne, known for his ambition and ruthlessness. Sheriff Allen remembered Thorne, a smooth talker, always impeccably dressed, a stark contrast to the dusty ranchers he often dealt with. Thorne had publicly, as Ramon was escorted home, Sandoval turned to Allen. Heavy vehicle, pre-dawn, near the South Access Road. That road isn't regularly patrolled. If someone wanted to move Jess's truck, and maybe other expressed frustration with holdout ranchers who, in his view, were impeding agricultural progress. He'd left equipment, unseen. That would be the way to do it. But who around here had the means and the motive-strong AgriCorp, a couple of years after Jess disappeared, supposedly for a more lucrative position out of state? Another memory surfaced. Enough for something this elaborate. Alan thought of Jess's words. Sometimes it's the ones in this one from Alan's own past. During the initial search for Jess, he recalled seeing Thorne at a community briefing fancy trucks, looking to swallow you whole, land and all. AgriCorp had access to all sorts of heavy machinery for. Thorne had expressed his condolences, offered the use of some of AgriCorp's resources, an offer that was politely declined by land clearing, and their disputes with Jess over water rights and fence lines had been bitter and protracted. They had deep pockets and powerful then, Sheriff Drummond, who had a known dislike for the man. Alan now remembered Thorne's eyes. Cold, assessing, lawyers. They had also employed a local contractor for some of their earth-moving work, a man named Chet Rourke betraying no genuine emotion. At the time, he'd dismissed it as the typical demeanor of a corporate man out, known for his surly demeanor and his even surlier crew. Rourke had also, Alan recalled with a jolt, of his element. Now, it felt chilling. The pieces were still scattered, but a faint, disturbing pattern was beginning done some occasional, ill-fated work for Jess years prior before a bitter falling out over shoddy workmanship and unpaid fees. And then there was Earl Pritchard, the mechanic Jess had fired. He didn't have the resources to emerge. Jess, fiercely protective of her land, particularly a remote section with potential water rights. An aggressive corporation, AgriCorp, but he knew Jess's truck inside and out. He also had a reputation for being vindictive and had known for wanting what it couldn't easily have. Unsolicited offers, unauthorized surveyors. Jess's growing anxiety reportedly made threats against Jess after she'd accused him of theft. Could he have nursed a grudge for that long? Then another call came in, the State Forensics Lab. They had finished a preliminary analysis of the soil and debris, compacted within the wheel wells and undercarriage of Jess's Dodge. Besides the expected desert soil consistent with much of P to this extreme, or was he a pawn, used for his skills? The faded file had yielded a whisper, a faint echo from the past. Ramon Vasquez's hesitant words, combined with Jess's own remembered foreboding in Inal County, they'd found trace elements of a specific type of red clay, rich in iron oxide, not commonly found in Section 34 where the truck was buried, nor prevalent on the main grazing lands of the Running W. However, didn't point to a single culprit, but they did begin to illuminate the dark stage upon which her murder had been planned. Geological surveys indicated that such clay deposits were present in isolated pockets within the higher elevations of Wild Horse Canyon, specifically and executed. The inertia of the old investigation was finally being overcome, not by a sudden flash of insight, but by the patient around areas with old mineral claims. Wild Horse Canyon, the Apache Tears claim, the unauthorized surveyors, Jess's anger, sifting of forgotten details, by listening to the voices that had been dismissed or unheard for too long. Sheriff Allen felt a grim satisfaction. They weren't just chasing ghosts anymore. They were following a faint, 9-year-old trail of... The fractured light of memory was beginning to coalesce, not yet illuminating the full picture, but casting a focused beam on tracks, just as Jess would have. The next step was to see where those tracks led, and who was wearing down that particular patch of dark, rugged land. A land Jess had loved, a land someone else may have coveted enough to lace up boots or drive the fancy trucks that had made them. He looked at the map again, his finger tracing the kill zone. The leather man on her dashboard, the concho belt, tucked away, these were symbols of her life, her independence. Someone had moved Jess's truck down that south access road in the dark, and someone had met them there. But the red clay that was a silent witness, a fingerprint from a place she may have been taken from, or where someone was ready to dig a very deep hole. Asterisk. The biting chill of the high desert dawn did little to cool the simmering anticipation in Sheriff Marcus Allen and Detective Maria Sandoval as they drove towards Wild Horse Canyon. The information gleaned from the resurrected case file, Ramon Vasquez's fragmented memories, Jess's Uncle Ray's recollections, and the damning presence of red clay from the canyon on Jess's entombed truck, all pointed to this rugged, remote slash in the earth. Jess had called it sacred. Now, they suspected it was also the profane stage for the prelude to her murder. They were accompanied by a small forensics team and Uncle Ray, who, despite his age and grief, insisted on being there. If there's something of Jess up there, something she left, I need to see it, he'd said, his voice raspy but firm. He remembered Jess talking about a particular overhang, a shallow cave near what she believed was the source of the Apache Tears Spring, a place she'd called her thinking spot. The final stretch of the journey was on ATVs, the terrain too treacherous for standard vehicles. The air grew thinner, cooler. The red clay deposits became more pronounced, staining the earth like old blood. As they neared the coordinates derived from geological maps, cross-referenced with Ray's memory of Jess's descriptions, a profound silence enveloped them, broken only by the wind whistling through unseen crevices. It was Sandoval who spotted it first, a barely discernible trail, almost reclaimed by nature, leading up towards a series of rock formations. And then, the overhang Ray had spoken of. Beneath it, sheltered from the elements, was a small dry alcove, almost invisible until one was right upon it. Inside, the air was still and cool. Initially, it looked empty, just packed earth and rock. But Ray, his eyes sharper than any of them when it came to his niece's habits, pointed towards a loose flat stone at the back of the alcove. Jess always liked to make things fit, he murmured, like a puzzle. Carefully, Allen prized the stone away. Beneath it, nestled in a hollowed-out space, was a small weathered ammunition box, the kind soldiers used. Its metal was cold to the touch. The clasp was stiff but yielded with a click that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several items. A disposable camera, a slim, leather-bound field notebook, and a single, folded topographic map with hand-drawn annotations. A collective breath was held. Sandoval, gloved, picked up the notebook. The entries were in Jess's familiar, strong handwriting, though the later ones seemed rushed, almost frantic. She began to read aloud, her voice steady but laced with a growing tension. Jess had indeed been documenting everything: the illegal survey markers, descriptions of unfamiliar vehicles near her property line, her growing certainty that Agricorp, under Elijah Thorne, was systematically trying to intimidate her into selling, possibly by tampering with her water sources, particularly the Apache Tears spring, which, though small, was vital for her northern pastures. She'd even managed to get partial license plate numbers. The 10th of October, 2014, Sandoval read, Thorne's vultures were back. Saw them myself near the spring. Not surveyors. These were harder men, carrying more than just tripods. I think they're trying to block the feeder veins to the spring. If they dry up Apache Tears, my north range is useless. Then, the camera. The forensics tech carefully opened it and extracted the film roll. It would need to be processed, but the implications were already staggering. Jess had been building a case. Alan picked up the annotated map. Jess had meticulously marked the locations of the bogus survey stakes, the dates she'd seen specific vehicles, and, circled in red, the area around the Apache Tears spring. There was also a small, almost imperceptible X, marked near a little-used access road on the southern edge of her property, the very road Ramon Vasquez lived near. She was onto them, Alan said, his voice grim. She knew Thorne was behind it. This box, this was her insurance. Her evidence, hidden where she felt safest. Then Sandoval reached the final entries in the notebook, dated the 16th of October, 2014, the day before Jess was last confirmed, seen alive by anyone other than her killer. Spoke to Deputy Miller today, Sandoval read, her voice suddenly faltering. She looked up at Alan, her eyes wide with disbelief. Deputy Frank Miller, from the County Land Management Office. He said he'd heard rumors about Agricorp's tactics, offered to look into the surveying irregularities discreetly, said he believed me. He's going to meet me up here, at the spring tomorrow evening, who the 17th of October. Says he knows a way to get proof Thorne can't deny. The silence in the alcove was absolute. Deputy Frank Miller, not a name that had come up prominently in connection with Agricorp or with Jess. Miller was a quiet, unassuming man, mid-40s, who'd worked for the county for over 15 years. He'd been a Pinal County Sheriff's deputy briefly in his youth, under Sheriff Drummond, before transitioning to land management. He was considered by most to be a benign, if somewhat inefficient, bureaucrat, a familiar face at community meetings, always polite, always taking notes. Alan felt a cold dread snake down his spine. Frank Miller, he knew him, had interacted with him dozens of times over the years on zoning issues, land use permits. The idea of Miller being involved, it was unthinkable. Yet, Jess's own words in her own hand named him an arranged meeting at her most vulnerable, sacred spot. It was a setup, Sandoval whispered, horrified. Miller wasn't helping her. He was delivering her. The twist was sickening. It wasn't just the corporate greed of Elijah Thorne or the thuggishness of men like Chet Rourke he might have hired. It was a betrayal from within, from someone Jess had trusted, someone who wore the cloak of officialdom, of quiet helpfulness. Thorne, with his resources and ruthlessness, was undoubtedly the architect of Jess's demise, the one who wanted her land, her water, her silence. But Frank Miller, the unassuming county employee, had been the Judas goat, leading her to slaughter. He would have known her routines, her thinking spot. He would have been the perfect tool for Thorne to gain her trust and lure her into a fatal ambush. The rage that filled Alan was cold and sharp. Thorne had likely orchestrated the sophisticated burial, using his connections and resources, perhaps Rourke and his equipment, to ensure Jess and her truck vanished without a trace, miles from where she was actually subdued or killed. But Miller had handed her over. The contents of the ammunition box, Jess's desperate, brave attempt to fight back from beyond the grave, had not only pointed to her killer's motive, but had also exposed a far more insidious rot. The shadows on the land Jess had spoken of to her uncle weren't just corporate predators. They were also the betrayers hiding in plain sight, the ones who smiled and nodded while sharpening the knife. Uncle Ray, who had listened in stunned silence, finally spoke, his voice choked with a terrible new wave of grief. That nice Mr. Miller? He used to bring Jess paperwork sometimes, always so polite. He covered his face with his trembling hands. The Apache Tears Spring, once a symbol of Jess's sanctuary, had now confessed the ultimate treachery. The evidence was clear. Elijah Thorne was the puppet master, but Frank Miller had pulled the strings that led Jess into the fatal trap. The next step was no longer just about finding Thorne, who was reportedly living a comfortable life out of state. It was about confronting the serpent in their own garden. The drive back from Wild Horse Canyon was heavy with a grim, furious resolve. The contents of Jess Whitman's ammunition box, her meticulously documented fears, her brave but ultimately futile attempt to gather evidence, and the sickening revelation of Frank Miller's betrayal had transformed the investigation. Elijah Thorne, the ruthless corporate puppet master, was still the primary target for ordering Jess's murder. But Frank Miller, okay, I will now write part 6, the concluding part of the story, where the truth is fully. The unassuming county employee was the serpent whose venom had been far more personal, more insidious. Back at the Pinal County, exposed and justice, in some form, is sought. The sheriff's department. The atmosphere was electric. The processed film from Jess's disposable camera yielded grainy but damning images drive back from Wild Horse Canyon, was heavy with a grim, sickening understanding. The desolate beauty of Jess Whitman's, shots of unfamiliar trucks near her property, men who were clearly not surveyors working near the Apache Tears Spring, and even sacred spot was now irrevocably tainted by the treachery it had witnessed. The contents of the ammunition box, her meticulously gathered evidence, her final, desperate words naming her betrayer, rested in an evidence bag on the seat between Sheriff Marcus, one blurry but recognizable image of Elijah Thorne himself, scowling, pointing towards the spring during a clandestine visit to the canyon. Allen and Detective Maria Sandoval, a tangible testament to her courage and the insidious nature of the conspiracy that had claimed her life. Jess had captured her tormentors. Sheriff Marcus Allen wasted no time. A warrant was swiftly obtained for Frank. Their first stop was not the sheriff's department, but a secure facility where the roll of film from Jess Miller's arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and aiding and abetting a homicide. Simultaneously, a multi-state alert was issued for Elijah Thorne, whose last known address was a luxury condo in Scottsdale, though intelligence suggested he frequently traveled. His disposable camera was processed with urgent priority. As the images slowly materialized, they provided chilling visual confirmation of her notebook entries. The arrest of Frank Miller sent a shockwave through the county offices. He was taken into custody at his cluttered desk in the land-grainy photographs of unfamiliar trucks near her property line, shots of men who were clearly not surveyors near the Apache Tears Spring, and even management department, his face paling to a sickly gray as Allen and Sandoval approached, the warrant held out like a death sentence. A long-distance, slightly blurred image of what looked like Elijah Thorne's distinctive silver SUV parked discreetly on a dirt. His colleagues stared in stunned disbelief as the quiet, bespectacled man they knew as Frank was handcuffed and led away. Track overlooking the canyon. Jess had been a far more dangerous adversary to AgriCorp than they had realized. She had, in his initial reaction, was one of bewildered denial, then a stammering insistence that he was merely a friend of Jesset, just been a stubborn rancher. She'd been an investigator, building a damning case against them. Armed with Jess's notes, the photographs, the trace evidence of red clay, and Ramon Vasquez's testimony, Allen's trying to help her. But in the interrogation room, faced with enlargements of Jess's handwritten notes detailing, knew he had enough to bring Elijah Thorne back to Arizona to face charges for orchestrating Jess Whitman's murder. Their planned meeting, the photographs she'd taken, and the undeniable fact that her body had been found buried after she was last supposed to meet him, Miller's composure began to crumble. He was not a hardened criminal, merely the legal battle would be immense. Thorne was wealthy, well-connected, and would undoubtedly employ a formidable defense team. But Jess, a weak man, swayed by greed, and perhaps fear. Detective Sandoval, her voice calm but relentless, laid out the evidence. Es's voice, echoing from her 9-year-old notebook, was powerful. The more immediate, and Jess trusted you, Frank. She thought you were her ally. You met her at the Apache Tears Spring on the evening some ways more painful, Task was confronting Deputy Frank Miller. Miller was called into the Sheriff's Department of the 17th of October 2014, didn't you? Miller, his hands trembling, finally broke pretext of discussing an old land use permit related to Section 34. He arrived looking exactly as he always did. Slightly, the story tumbled out, a sordid tale of mounting debts, quiet threats from Thorne's associates, and eventually rumpled. A pair of reading glasses perched on his balding head, a sheaf of irrelevant papers clutched in his, a substantial payoff for his cooperation. Thorne, through AgriCorp, had been desperate to acquire the land around the Apache Hand. He offered a polite, almost diffident smile. Allen and Sandoval met him in the main interview room. Tears Spring, not just for its minimal water, but because geological surveys, which AgriCorp had secretly and illegally conducted, suggested the atmosphere was deliberately neutral. Allen began by asking routine questions about land management policies in 2014, gradually the presence of valuable rare earth minerals beneath it, a far greater prize than water rights. Jess's refusal to sell steering the conversation towards the area around the Running W and Wild Horse Canyon. Miller answered calmly, his responses bureaucratic and devoid of any apparent, and her increasing vigilance were a major obstacle. Miller confessed that his role was to lure Jess to the spring under the pretext emotion. He claimed to remember Jess Whitman only vaguely, as one of many ranchers he'd had peripheral dealings with. He of providing her with proof of AgriCorp's illegal activities. He was to ensure she was alone. He admitted that expressed mild, professional surprise at the recent discovery of her truck. Then, Sandoval placed a high-quality copy of the When he arrived. Thorne was already there, not with documents, but with two menacing figures Miller recognized as Chet Rourke. Last page of Jess's notebook on the table in front of him. Jess's handwriting, clear and strong, detailed the disgruntled contractor and one of Rourke's brutish employees. Miller claimed he hadn't known Jess would be harmed her meeting with him. Miss Whitman seemed to believe you were helping her, Mr. Miller. Sandoval that he thought Thorne only intended to scare her badly into selling. He said he'd left before said, her voice quiet but unyielding. She wrote about a meeting you arranged with her at the Apache Tears Spring. Anything physical happened, taking his blood money and driving away, consumed by guilt but too terrified to go to the authorities. On the evening of the 17th of October, 2014, she said you were going to provide her with proof. His self-serving excuses meant little. He had delivered Jess to her murderers, armed with Miller's confession against AgriCorp. Miller's face for the first time lost its placid composure, a flicker of something, which implicated Thorne as the instigator and Rourke as a key enforcer. The net tightened. Chet Rourke was fear, perhaps, or surprise at being so directly confronted, crossed his features before being quickly suppressed. He stared at the paper, his Adam's apple bobbing. He licked his lips. I don't recall apprehended at his dilapidated ranch, his initial bluster quickly evaporating when confronted with Miller's statement. He, too, began that specific meeting. He stammered, his voice losing its confident bureaucratic tone. It was a long time ago, to talk, hoping for a lesser sentence, detailing how he and his man had subdued Jess, and how Thorne had overseen I had many informal discussions with landowners. This wasn't informal, Mr. Miller, Allen interjected, his voice the chillingly efficient process of transporting Jess's truck to the pre-scouted burial site in Section 34 like cold steel. This was a specific appointment, at a remote location, documented by Miss Whitman hours before she, and using Rourke's own backhoe, conveniently borrowed for a non-existent county maintenance job, arranged effectively disappeared. A location where she was likely ambushed and either subdued or murdered. Miller began to sweat. He picked up by Miller, to dig the deep grave under the cover of darkness. Thorne, Rourke claimed, had personally ensured Jess was dead. The paper, his hand trembling slightly. This is just her word. She could have been mistaken, or before she was buried with her truck, a final cold-blooded act to guarantee her silence. Elijah Thorne proved, or perhaps she was trying to implicate me for some reason. Why would she do that, Frank? Allen pressed more elusive. For 2 weeks, he was a ghost, always one step ahead. But the relentless pressure from multiple agencies, using his first name with deliberate, chilling familiarity. Why would a woman who thought you were her ally, fueled by the national media attention the case had garnered, finally cornered him? He was arrested by federal agents while last hope against a powerful corporation lie about meeting you at the place she was last seen alive by anyone who wasn't trying to attempting to board a private jet under an assumed name at a small airfield in New Mexico. Extradited back to Arizona, kill her? The carefully constructed dam of Miller's composure began to crack. He looked from Allen to Sandoval. Thorne, ever the arrogant corporate player, maintained his innocence, his high-powered lawyers attempting to dismiss Miller and Rourke as eyes darting like a trapped animal. The evidence from Jess's hidden box was laid out, piece by damning piece. The map unreliable, coerced witnesses. But Jess Whitman's own words from her hidden notebook, her grainy photographs, the undeniable evidence of, the photos, the context of Thorne's relentless pressure. The interrogation lasted for hours. Miller initially denied everything, then the red clay linking her truck to the canyon where she was ambushed, and the corroborating, if self-serving, confessions offered increasingly convoluted and improbable explanations. But faced with Jess's own words, the photographic evidence, and the undeniable fact of his co-conspirators, built an irrefutable case. The trials, held a year later, were of her truck being found buried deep in the desert after Thorne's men were known to be active. His defenses crumbled. A grim spectacle. Frank Miller, pale and broken, received a lengthy sentence for his role in the conspiracy. Chet Rourke. Finally, broken and weeping, Frank Miller confessed. Thorne had approached him months before Jess's disappearance. Agricorp had discovered for his direct involvement in the murder and burial, would likely die in prison. Elijah Thorne, despite the best efforts of his legal team through their illicit surveying that the Apache Tears spring, while small, was geologically linked to a much larger aquifer they desperately, was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and a host of other charges related to illegal land practices and witness needed to access for their expanding water-intensive crops. Jess's land was the key. Thorne had initially offered Miller a substantial tampering. The judge, citing Thorne's callous disregard for human life and his calculated, predatory greed, handed down a sentence bribe to help falsify survey reports or find leverage to force Jess to sell. When Jess proved uncooperative and started of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, Pinal County was a changed place. The inertia, her own investigation, Thorne's plan had turned murderous. Miller, deeply in debt from gambling and terrified of Thorne's ruth of justice, had been overcome. But the scars remained. The sheriff's department, under Allen's leadership, implementedlessness, had become a pawn. He admitted to luring Jess to the spring under the guise of helping her. He claimed new protocols for investigating missing persons in remote areas, particularly women, ensuring that assumptions were never again allowed to overshadow evidence. The case became he didn't know Thorne intended to kill her, only to scare her badly and seize her evidence. But he a stark lesson in the dangers of unchecked corporate power and the devastating consequences of personal betrayal. For Uncle Ray, there knew two of Thorne's security men, likely Chet Rourke's crew, were waiting. He'd heard Jess scream as he'd driven away, a sound that had haunted his nightmares for 9 years. He'd received was no true closure, only a bitter, aching satisfaction that Jess's murderers had faced a human court. He established a substantial sum of money, laundered through a series of shell companies, shortly after Jess vanished. Elijah Thorne was a small foundation in Jess's name, dedicated to supporting women in agriculture and protecting vulnerable lands from predatory development. The arrested a week later at his luxury golf resort in another state, the warrant served with satisfying abruptness. He was arrogant running W, though diminished, continued, a younger cousin stepping in, inspired by Jess's legacy, the Apache Tears spring and dismissive, his high-powered lawyers immediately decrying the charges as baseless and politically motivated. The legal battle would be long still flowed, a tiny trickle of life in the harsh landscape. It was no longer Jess's secret thinking spot, but it, and arduous. Chet Rourke, the contractor, was also brought in, faced with Miller's confession, and became a quiet place of pilgrimage for those who remembered her. The bullhorns from her resurrected Dodge Ram, cleaned and restored, were evidence placing his heavy equipment near the burial site around the time of Jess's disappearance, uncovered from old GPS logs from eventually mounted on a simple stone monument near the entrance to Wild Horse Canyon, not as a symbol of defiance in life, but as his machinery that his company, surprisingly, still had archived. He eventually struck a deal, implicating Thorne fully in exchange testament to a truth unearthed, a voice finally heard. The desert had been forced to give up its secrets, and in doing so, had revealed not only the depth of human cruelty, but also the enduring power of a single, brave voice determined for a lesser charge related to illegal disposal of a body and conspiracy. He described the grim, late-night task of burying Jess's not to be silenced, even from beyond the grave. The echoes from that steel tomb had finally found their reckoning in the dust. Truck, with her body already inside, under Thorne's direct and explicit orders. Jess had been killed at the spring,